and females moving forward here. So I always like this picture. So this is a scanning electron micrograph. I think this is a human egg, and that's a sperm. So certainly there are dramatic differences in terms of the gametes they're producing, and I think that sort of echoes through the whole difference in being male versus the difference in being female. So males and females are basically reproductive strategies you can think of in terms of differences in terms of how much they're going to invest in any given gamete. So males are kind of in the business of investing in very large numbers of very small gametes that are effectively disposable. Whereas females instead invest in small numbers of huge gametes. So they're kind of in the business of producing viable offspring, whereas males are in the business of producing lots of offspring. And that's basically what they're targeting. Some bird eggs are going to be somewhere upwards of 10 to 15% of body mass. So I mean, if you think about, like, if humans were producing something, and maybe that's not that far from the truth, really, in terms of what humans invest in. But so I weigh something around I don't know, like 160 pounds or something. So 10 to 15% of my body mass would be investing somewhere on the, I can't do math in my head, something, over 20 pounds of investment in some kind of a reproductive experience. And that's not far from what human females do in terms of their reproductive investment. So in any given population, because females are producing huge eggs, and therefore relatively small numbers of them, in any given population there will be far more sperm available in a population usually than eggs, because sperm are basically disposable. And simultaneously to that, that probably means there's probably going to be more males looking to reproduce at any one time because they have this cheap disposable gamete than there will be females. So you can think of this as, I think this is kind of a good thought experiment just to sort of think through these differences. If you think about what a single male would do, a single male could theoretically, in most species, a single male could probably theoretically fertilize the eggs of thousands of females in many cases. Every female that a male mates with is another opportunity to foster more offspring. So the more females a male mates with, the more offspring they're likely to achieve. So male's fitness is going to be maximized by mating with a large number of females. Females, on the other hand, it doesn't really work the same way. They're producing a small number of large gametes. So they could go and mate with a large number of males, but they probably would have the same number of offspring as if they just mated with one male, right? I mean, because one male can very likely fertilize all of their eggs, and so there's little to gain by mating with more than one male. So you will maximize fitness by maximizing the number of viable eggs, and this is sort of the key thing, is it's the number of viable eggs that they can produce. And a way to do that is to ensure that your reproductive partner is of the highest quality that they can be in terms of their health, in terms of the genes that they're providing for your offspring, because they are contributing half of the genes for your offspring, and also in terms of any kind of assistance that they provide you, or they provide the offspring, in terms of parental care, or protection of you, or other sorts of resource assistance that you can gain by mating with that particular individual. So it's a pretty different kind of dichotomy, and it's always, we're talking about animals, and I think it's always kind of fun to start thinking about what's going on with humans, and there are some interesting things that go on with humans that I think are related to some of these ideas, but we're going to be focusing mostly on bowerbirds and other kinds of animals through this discussion. Because there's so many, usually in any given population, because there's usually so many males that are ready to mate, and because they can mate with more than one female readily, and they're very happy to do so, and they're motivated to do so, there's typically competition among males, the sperm producers, for access to females who are the egg producers. And so because of that, we usually say that there's a male-biased operational sex ratio. So an operational sex ratio basically is not looking at what is the actual, a pure sex ratio would be how many females and how many males are in a population. An operational sex ratio would be looking at this moment how many individuals that are male versus female that are seeking mating opportunities at this moment. And most of the time there will be far more males seeking a mating opportunity than there are females. And the reason is The moment a female mates, she really is kind of out of the game. She's not needing to mate anymore most of the time. There's no benefit to her to do so, whereas there is still benefits to males to be continuing to seek out mating opportunities. So we often are dealing with a male-biased operational sex ratio, and because of that, most of the time it's males competing over access to females. That's kind of like the default expectation. It doesn't always happen though, and we will talk on the homework about some cool examples where the opposite happens, where females actually have to compete for males because you get to have a female-biased operational sex ratio where there's more females seeking to mate than there are actually males available to mate. And I think those are always really cool examples. So this is really just talking about investment in gametes. Females often also have higher post-zygotic parental investment as well, though. So by post-zygotic, I mean basically parental care or any kind of things that happen after the formation of the zygote. So the production of the gametes is one thing, but the zygote, so the zygote is the fertilized egg, once you have a zygote, any sort of further investment that is done, often females will have higher post-zygotic investment as well. That's certainly true, for example, in mammals, right? So in most mammals, if you think about like mice or elephants or whatever kind of mammal you choose to think about, females have, there's an internal gestation period that's sometimes very long. Males really can't do anything about that and can't really assist with that in any kind of a way. So the females do all of that work in terms of maintaining that animal or those offspring until they birth them. And then even post-birthing, what do mammals do? Like, what's a defining characteristic of mammal? It's the mammary glands, and so the production of milk. Females do that, males do not. And so again, there's an increased parental investment on the part of the female that is not there and not available to the male to invest in. This is also true across many other animals as well. And in some cases, in the case of mammals, there are sort of like these physiological differences that do limit the degree to which a male mouse can contribute to parental care to their offspring. But even across other animals where there's not so much the physiological differences, there are reasons why males tend on average across different species to invest less in paternity and less in parental care. One reason is that they often have less certainty about the paternity of their offspring than females. So, if a female bird or crocodile lays an egg, she pretty much knows that's her offspring, right? I mean, there's not much ambiguity there. But males that she may have mated with have less assurance that they are in fact the fathers of those offspring. She could have mated with multiple males, and so they have less certainty about whether or not that's their offspring. If it's not their offspring, then they're not really gaining any reproductive success by helping investing parental care to help make sure that those offspring make it, right? Certainly it's good for their offspring to make it, so if there's a way they can increase their offspring survivorship, that's advantageous to the male. But if they don't know it's their offspring, and that doesn't mean like they're consciously aware of it, but if selection is operating on the standpoint that it's not necessarily their offspring, then males have less of an advantage to investing in parental care. Certainly males have a cost. Any time that they spend parenting is time that they're not spending courting or seeking out additional mating opportunities. So it's sort of like an opportunity cost. These missed fertilization opportunities is a major cost for males, but it's not that much of a cost for females because she's limited oftentimes in terms of how many eggs or how many clutches she could actually produce over a period of time. Males' energetic investment in parenting also means that they have less investment in fertilizing. So again, there is some cost to producing all these sperm. So if you're investing in parental care, you're not going to be able to produce perhaps as many sperm. And again, there is some sort of additional limit. So if those are reasons why not to parent, why might you parent? Like under what sorts of conditions do you think males might be likely to provide parental care? We'll talk more parental care in then chapter 11, but like, what do you think? So in those cases, so if you're monogamous, can you talk that out? I could talk it out for you, but.
So instead of pairing with a bunch of females, like you pick one female and mate with that same female for life.
And every
offspring that comes from that female
Yeah. So you would then, if you are in a monogamous relationship, and there are a lot of species that do this, or at least something that approaches monogamy, you would have more certainty about the paternity of your offspring. And so as your certainty in the paternity of your offspring increase, then selection should favor investment in parental care because it's more likely to positively impact your own offspring in those cases. So I think that makes sense, right? So whatever you can do to make it more likely, and a lot of times it's just a matter of just hanging around and being with that female, mating with her multiple times, perhaps discouraging the attentions of other males that might come by. These are things that you can do in order to increase your likelihood of paternity, and therefore often increase your likelihood of increase the likelihood of you actually fostering those offspring. Other things that come to mind? That's a good one. I do use a lot of bird examples. I know I do. It's because I like birds. But there's a bird example, and I can't remember which bird species it was, but it's something off. It's actually over in that same area, New Guinea, Indonesia, but it's not a bowerbird, where seasons can vary and on sort of an annual basis. And so some years you'll have really good years, and some years you'll have really bad years in terms of insect abundance. Bless you. And there was a study that I saw once that in really good years, the males tended to provide very little parental care. But in really bad years, where food was hard to come by, males invested more time in parental care. So they would actually assist at the nest. They would feed the young in those bad years. Why do you think they would do that? Like, why would there be that difference? Yeah, what do you think?
Because whenever the resources are so scarce, if they don't invest that time into raising children that are potentially theirs, then the children will die and then they won't be able to pass on their needs.
Yeah, I think that's the thing. So I think as you start to have more of or less of a likelihood that the male could, so if a male's decision is, do I help at the nest or do I not? If they don't help at the nest, a lot of times, well, the female hopefully is still going to help, and so they could just sort of do that. And that's not I'm not putting moral judgments on them. I'm just sort of saying that that's a calculus one could make. If they're likely to succeed, if the female's likely to succeed on her own, there's very little benefit to the male to investing a ton of energy into providing parental care. But as the likelihood of the female successfully getting those chicks or pups or whatever it is that off and surviving, as that goes down, the better the payoff to the males, because the males certainly are going to benefit as offspring survive, and they need their offspring to survive. And so under those lean years, you might be more likely to encounter parental care. And you do see animals that provide substantial parental care or other kinds of assistance to females where the males are investing heavily. So in this case, this is a frog where it's hard to see it, but these are little tadpoles that are kind of stacked up on his back, and this is a male frog. So he's providing parental care in this case. This is a case, it's not really parental care, but this is a case of this is a katydid, I think, yeah, that's produced this enormous spermatophore. Which is sort of this nutritious, tasty snack that females get. It's full of enormous amounts of protein. It can be something like 20% of his body weight. There's that 20% number again. And he delivers this to the female along with his sperm. So he's not providing parental care per se, but his investment in a reproductive encounter is a lot more now because he's producing this spermatophore. And that can sometimes result in a situation where females will compete over access to these males in order to get access to those spermatophores. So in those cases, you're seeing additional investment by males in the process of reproduction, be it the actual reproductive encounter or parental care. All of this, though, is meant to kind of set up this question of how animals behave in reproductive encounters and the various traits that they have evolved in order to facilitate this. This all sets up this idea of sexual selection, which is in a way that's kind of the focus of the whole chapter. So what we're going to be looking at, and we'll come back to the bowerbirds at least in passing a few times, is trying to understand sexual selection and sort of distinguish that from natural selection. And we'll be looking at two major types of sexual selection that are related to success in mating opportunities. One of them is male-male competition, which we've already kind of looked at. We've looked at territoriality, for example. But here we're overtly looking at males competing with other males for access to females or access to opportunities to solicit matings from females. And then we'll also look at female choice. So trying to understand intersexual selection, how is it that females are choosing among males? And I'm calling it female choice. There are cases where you have male choice as well, certainly, especially in those situations where males are not, where there's not a strong operational sex ratio bias towards males, where there's roughly equal numbers of males and females, or maybe even sometimes where, like with the case of the katydids, males might be a little bit more rare than the females in terms of those that are available to mate. So let's sort of dive into this. Actually, before we do, this is actually a good, because we're going to, there's a lot of sort of consecutive sort of logical thought processes. So I'm going to take a break actually right now. So we're at 10:08. Let's break until 10:13. And then we'll do like a hardcore half hour into sexual selection. Okay? So this whole chapter we're talking about, we started with bowerbirds. We've been sort of talking in general about different kinds of animals. We've identified there's kind of a conflict between males and females. All of these things are setting up situations where individuals may differ in terms of their reproductive success based on their behaviors or based on the traits that they have. So their ability to produce a bower, the likelihood that they're going to use the bower to evaluate males. So we have seen certainly that male reproductive success is going to depend on the outcome of competition among males and preferences of females. And the female's reproductive success is, at least in part, maybe they're not going to, it's probably likely in most populations that most females are going to get to mate across most species. But their reproductive success may also depend on how choosy they are or the basis by which they're choosing males, because that will allow them to secure better quality, healthier mates, and thereby, avoid opportunities where they're going to, get infected with something. Maybe they'll get more resources from males by choosing wisely. Any kind of difference that you're dealing with where there are heritable differences that are passed on from parent to offspring that affect reproductive success, that's an opportunity for natural selection to happen, right? So, we define natural selection, or we basically said natural selection is sort of the inevitable consequence when we have variation in a trait, and the trait is heritable, and there's the variations cause differences in reproductive success. That goes back, I think, to chapter 1. Sexual selection is basically a kind of natural selection. So sexual selection is defined as the advantage, I'm going to read it right off the screen here. It's the advantage that certain individuals have over other individuals of the same sex and species in exclusive relation to reproduction. So we've always been focused on reproductive success in natural selection, but here we're strictly focusing on kind of the act of reproduction, or the act of getting the opportunity to mate. And that does, I think, make it a little bit different from natural selection. Natural selection includes all those things, but natural selection also includes, predator avoidance and habitat selection and foraging and all these other things that aren't strictly related to reproduction. Sexual selection is focused on reproduction specifically and traits that are associated with reproduction. But it really is just kind of like a kind of natural selection is how I like to view it. Sexual selection is going to favor traits that give you an advantage in terms of mating success. And so because of that, sexual selection is likely to drive the evolution of traits that are costly. You can drive the evolution of traits that actually negatively affect survival. So we're actually harming our survivorship. But they will convey fitness advantages in relation to either male-male competition, over access to mates or access to good, sites to solicit mates, and male-female courtship and mating. And so you do see just sometimes utterly ridiculous traits, and this is part of why I think reproductive behavior is so interesting, because you see sometimes just absurd traits and absurd behaviors that actually seem to be counterproductive in terms of survivorship, and yet they may help them in terms of their reproductive success. These are scanning electron micrograph figures of dung beetles, which I don't know if you're into dung beetles. Dung beetles are really interesting. I mean, despite the fact that they rolled little balls of dung around, which is kind of fun, many of these species of dung beetles grow these really elaborate horns. So this is kind of false color. So you can see the size of their eye is shown here. And this guy actually has this sort of substantial horn that's sticking up out of the top. This is another male. And in this male, what you're seeing is, you again see the eye, but you see that they did not produce that much of a horn. In encounters with one another, these individuals that have the horns, these actually, they're not so much weapons, but they do use them to kind of as levers, and they're able to push these other males away, these types of males away, more successfully when they have horns than when they don't. But I think the thing that's really interesting here is that there's a cost that they're paying for having these horns. And maybe you can see it. Like, look at the size of the eye here versus here. Can you see that? So, you know, you can get out, if you wanted, you could get out your rulers or something and measure it. But these individuals actually have larger eyes than when they don't produce the horns. So they should have better eyesight. In fact, they do. You can go through and measure the optics of their eyes and evaluate how well they'll be able to resolve images. And so what actually seems to be happening is that the investment required to produce a large horn actually causes them to have a trade-off where they decrease the size of their eye, which I think is really cool. This one, it's hard to see. Again, we've got this sort of contrast issue with this projector. But this is, I think this is a long-tailed widowbird, if I remember the species right. So you can sort of make out a normal-looking bird up here, and it looks like the bird kind of ends here, but it actually doesn't. If we could really see it, there's a tail that extends all the way down to here. So they have this absurdly long tail that's like 3 or 4 times the body size of this animal. And it's flying around, and it, you know, when you see it flying, it looks like it's just kind of like dragging this tail through the air, and it basically is. It certainly is causing a negatively impacting their aerodynamics and their drag. And yet they seem to produce it, probably because it aids them in terms of sexual selection, either in terms of male-male contests or in terms of female choice. The females do not have that tail in the species, which certainly sort of speaks to the fact that this is probably not a helpful thing for their reproductive success. Horns, I think, are really cool. I mean, and this image I've always liked because this sort of shows something about the diversity of animal horn development over evolutionary history. And a lot of the species that are on here are extinct, but there certainly are modern ones as well. And they cover a wide range of animals. And all these animals are producing horns. So, you know, you've got, you know, this is a lizard. You've got fish that have horns. This is, you guys know what that is, right? It's a narwhal. Yeah, so, you know, these guys have horns. You've got a styracosaur. So there's a dinosaur. That's, I think, a Goliath beetle. Trilobites. You guys know trilobites? So, like, there were trilobites that had horns, too. We found them. They're extinct now, but they're fossils. This is sort of an extinct mammal. They don't exist anymore, but they're sort of a rhino relative, as is this guy. So horns have been around for a while and have occurred and evolved independently in numerous animals. And in probably most of these situations, if not all of them, they're used in some kind of a sexual encounter, be it male-male competition or male-female interactions. It certainly is the case that if you have male-male competition, that this can, as males are basically competing with one another over access to females, this can lead to differences in access to mates. So this is this is data that are coming from work on baboons. There are a lot of people that basically will just watch troops of baboons. They'll monitor and observe them over extended periods of time, and you can get some really interesting data based on the observational studies that they're doing on these baboons. So I'll start actually over here. This is basically just showing within a population of baboons, how does your dominance rank if you're a male? Your dominance rank within the population, and that's largely achieved through competitions with males where you're basically fighting and scrapping with other males. your dominance rank, how does that is that associating with the number of offspring that you're leaving within the troop? And I think you can see there's a pretty tight relationship here where as dominance rank decreases, so we're going from the highest dominance rank, so this would be the alpha male here, and then this would be, down here, this would be the most submissive of the males within the troop, that's number 13. How does the proportion of offspring relate to that dominance rank? And it relates very strongly, right? So that the alpha male is siring, something like about 30% of all the offspring, probably about a third of all the offspring within the troop. Males numbers 2, 3, 4, and 5 are basically accounting for everything else, all the other offspring across them, and none of them are as good as, or getting as many offspring as the alpha male, but they're all getting some. The rest of these males are basically not siring offspring at all. So there's a very tight relationship between your ability to compete in baboon troops, at least, in interactions between males that allows you to better monopolize females or gain access to females during times when they're ovulating, and as a result, you gain more offspring. Here is a comparison. This one's a little bit of an odd graph. So I always have to, again, it's one of these I have to take a moment and just figure out the axis. So this is looking across groups. And for every group that is in their data set, every group of baboon that is in their data set, they were basically doing this study. And they're trying to correlate male dominance rank to ability to monopolize females. So here, there's a pretty decent correlation, right? So the higher your rank, the better you monopolize females and the more offspring you leave. This is just one troop. But then what they did is, so they related each of those and they got a correlation value. So a correlation of 1 would mean a perfect relationship between your dominance rank and the number of offspring you leave. Whereas a correlation of 0, so this would be, very, very tight relationship between those things. A correlation of 0 would mean there's no relationship at all. So dominance rank had nothing to do with the number of offspring you leave. And then over here, -1 would mean there would be an inverse relationship, where that would be that the most dominant male leaves the least offspring and vice versa, which that would be counterintuitive, but that's what that's intending to mean. And so then they plotted that correlation within each of the groups, and then they're depicting that correlation and counting on how many groups fall within each of these different correlation categories. That's kind of a long-winded way to say the vast majority of the troops, there's a very high correlation between your dominance rank and your ability to monopolize females in baboon troops. So again, this is just one troop. This is a much nicer study in a lot of ways because it has such a large sample size. I mean, look at so here we're doing, that's 18 troops, and then here's another 16 or so, and continuing on down, that's a pretty large sample size of comparisons across troops, and there's a very consistent thing. It doesn't happen always. There's a couple oddball troops here and there, but most of the time, your dominance rank is going to determine your reproductive success in a baboon colony. So those kinds of aggressive encounters, I'm calling that overt competition, where there's like this really obvious clash between males and females. You've got deer sparring with each other, or you've got baboons punching each other and trying to claw each other or bite each other. There's another way in which males can compete over mates, though. And that's something called sperm competition. Sometimes it's referred to as like a cryptic competition. And the cool thing about this is that in sperm competition, you're dealing with a situation where it's not always obvious. You don't always see the competition in sort of an overt fighting fashion. In fact, usually what you're seeing is competition more at sort of the sperm level. So to understand this, if you think about it, we usually tend to think, okay, males will all tend to produce basically the same kind of sperm. But it could be that some males have better sperm or produce more sperm than other individuals. So by better sperm, I mean maybe some sperm can swim faster. Maybe some are better at penetrating into an egg. Maybe some are better at surviving outside of the body. So if these are external fertilizers, maybe some are better at surviving and passing through the water column than others, and therefore they're more likely to reach their target. Those better sperm might cost more to produce, and so we might see some individuals investing more in sperm quality than others. If that's true, then we could have a situation where males are actually differing in this trait and competing at the level of the actual sperm that they're producing, perhaps in addition to other kinds of more overt competitions that they have. And you do see this a lot. You have to look for it. And so it took a while to really start to identify these things, but probably about 20 years ago, this literature on sperm competition started to really become fleshed out. And it resulted in some really cool studies that have found some neat behaviors. I think one of the coolest behaviors that we'll see are cases where we have alternative reproductive tactics, where different individuals will pursue different approaches to reproduction. So bluegill actually do this, and this is always, I always enjoy this one. You'll have dominant males that'll basically secure kind of a nesting area, and females will come into that nesting area, and females will approach those males, and those males will try to well, they don't really mate with each other, they have external fertilization, so the females will release their eggs, and then the males will release his sperm, and so the female's releasing them into sort of an egg-laying midden area, and then the males often patrol that area and to some degree even protect the eggs and try to solicit additional females to come by. That's basically what the dominant males will do. So these would be the biggest, most aggressive, strongest, most powerful males that are in the population. But then you have these other males. So you'll have sneaker males that just kind of wait in the sidelines. So they kind of lurk off to the side, and they wait for females to come in and start laying eggs next to the dominant males, and then they just basically bolt in, release sperm, and then bolt away. So this is their job, is they sneak in, they sneak out. You also have female mimic males that the males look a lot like females, so they have similar size, similar patterning, and as a result, they're able to sometimes approach a male and a female that are the dominant male and a female. And again, when the female lays her eggs, they will try to release their sperm directly on those eggs. And they kind of slip in, they release sperm, and then they bolt away. And it turns out if you actually assess the quality of the sperm, the female mimic males and the sneaker males will have higher quality sperm. They will actually swim faster than the sperm that are released by the dominant males. So we have a difference in the quality of sperm that exists here, and a difference in reproductive behavior. And the great thing about all of this is that you can go in and try to assess the reproductive success of these different approaches. And it sort of depends on the species that you encounter. But under certain conditions, the sneaker males can have just as good a reproductive success and leave just as many offspring as the dominant males. So, we tend to think like, oh, the dominant males, that's got to be like, that's like the ideal type of male that you might pursue. But in terms of reproductive success, sometimes the sneaker males or the female mimic males will do just as well. So that's one example of sperm competition. Here's some other more overt examples where males are just basically trying to remove or otherwise deal with the fact that females mate multiple times. And there are a lot of species where females do mate multiple times, and males will sometimes try to deal with that. So here's an example of damselflies. Damselflies have this really, this is one of these sort of lovely accidents. But damselflies, I don't know if you ever, I can't even really see it. Let me turn the lights down one more. It's just so lovely. They produce kind of a heart when they mate. I don't know if you ever noticed that. So, so let's see. This is, where are we here? I'm getting confused. I think that is, no, this is, shoot, I'm forgetting which one is which. And I apologize. Does anybody know? If you worked with Dr. Loya, he definitely would know, and I'm blanking on it. One of these is the male, and one of these is the female. I think this is the male, and I think he's sort of reaching up and delivering his sperm to the female, and she's kind of clasping him here, but I don't know, I'm not sure on that. But if you can take your page, if you have this on your notes, and turn it to the right, you'll notice it's in a little bit of a heart shape. So they do have this romantic sort of a pairing formation that they perform. But in addition to all that, the males, if you look at their intermittent organ, so this is basically their penis, they have these really bizarro structures. So this is the intermittent organ of the penis of a damselfly. And you can see, like, most of the structure is just basically a delivery device, so sperm would be released right here. but they have these little barbs that kind of stick off the side. So here's this, it's on a little projector, and here's this little barb, and if you zoom in on this structure, that's what you're seeing here. You see it's actually got a bunch of these little spikes sticking off of the thing. This apparently is a sperm scrub brush, effectively. So what they will do is males will encounter females, and as they mate with them, the male will first move its penis sort of in and out, and basically cleanse and remove any sperm that were present within the female's reproductive tract before he actually releases his sperm. And you can even see on this picture, this little sort of blob of, I don't know, looks like dust basically here. That's zoomed in on this picture. This is basically just a little mat of sperm. And so they use these barbs to remove the sperm, and it seems to be very effective. So the estimates are that it's removing something on the order of about 90% of competing sperm before he actually releases his sperm. And so again, this is competition at the level of sperm. You're trying to remove the sperm of other individuals before you actually produce your own. We see sperm competition in primates. And I always thought this was a hilarious picture. Well, both parts of this are hilarious. Okay, so this is looking at what's going on with chimpanzees. So this, of course, is a human. This is a chimpanzee's brain, and this is actually a chimpanzee's testicle. Chimpanzees have extremely large testicles, and that's depicted in this picture here. So we have a bonobo, a chimpanzee, humans, orangutans, and gorillas. And what they're trying to depict here is basically the relative body size of these different animals as well as the relative testis size. So what you end up seeing is that bonobos and chimpanzees have very large testis size relative to their body size. Humans are kind of intermediate. Orangutans and gorillas tend to have relatively small testes relative to their body size. The explanation for this is that it has to do with the promiscuity and the number of matings that females will have in these populations, and therefore the amount of sperm competition that the males in these species encounter. In the case of gorillas, they tend to have a fairly dominant male that secures most of the matings within his troop. And so by overt competition, he's able to eliminate most of the potential sperm competition and has relatively little sperm competition to deal with. And so the result is that his testes are relatively small because he didn't have to produce that much in the way of sperm. Bonobos, you guys know about bonobos? They're basically a type of chimpanzee. They're actually listing them as different species here. I guess that's a little debatable. These guys mate all the time. Like, this is their social structure, is you sort of, you go up to an individual, you say hi, you shake hands, and then you mate. And that's kind of what they do all the time, is they're just constantly mating. So sperm competition is ridiculous in bonobos. In chimpanzees, it's not quite as bad, but they still have a very high amount of sperm competition. And so the result is that bonobos and chimpanzees produce, well, they have enormous testes, and they produce enormous amounts of sperm that are released with each ejaculate. And the idea here is that you're basically trying to overwhelm the sperm that other individuals may have released. Chimpanzees, at least I know, also, they produce kind of after their ejaculate, they produce kind of a sperm plug. It's almost like the semen creates sort of like a foam seal that is intended to at least slow down or reduce the likelihood that the female is going to mate, again, at least relatively soon, because it helps to prevent actual coupling with them, because you basically are producing this sort of foam insert to prevent additional copulations. I mean, it's just bizarre, crazy, fun stuff. So again, we've got this case where you have a lot of sperm competition. In those cases where you have sperm competition, you see adaptations where males will produce, larger testes, which, cost resources in order to try to drown out and prevent that additional competition that you're dealing with. There are other defenses, of course, against sperm competition. We sort of mentioned you could just be really good at competing overtly, and therefore you can repel other males. Here are some just other examples of cases that have been documented. There have been studies on humans, and I think some of these are just really fun studies to read. There's a pair of studies that were released back in the 80s, but the acknowledgement section is just hilarious because they're trying to just like thank people for doing this. But they basically had people collect, after they had to track with their partner all the mating experiences that they encountered. And then they actually had to try to collect the semen after each mating encounter that they had, and then package that and provide it to the researchers so that they could measure number of sperm counts, volume of sperm, these kinds of things. And one of the many interesting studies from or findings from that study is that human males tend to release more sperm both immediately and after his or her mating partner, well, no, his mating partner travels. So we get more sperm released when there is increased likelihood of sperm competition because the female is leaving, if she's going on a business trip or something. He will tend to produce more sperm under those experiences. So apparently humans do this too, even if I don't think we tend to be aware of that. Here's another cool one. So male orb spiders, after they mate, they will sometimes, the males have these little pedipalps, which are basically almost like, they're kind of they're almost like a modified limb. They're not as large as their walking legs, but they're kind of structured in that way. These are the intermittent organs for spiders, though. And what some species will do is they'll actually insert them into the genital openings of the female. The pedipalps will inflate to kind of secure into the genitalia of the female. They'll deliver their sperm, and then oftentimes they'll just kind of, either the males will remain attached permanently, or their pedipalps will just literally break off and remain present within the genitalia of the female and act as basically a sperm plug. So again, we've got kind of a sperm plug solution to try to avoid further competition to prevent other males from mating with that female. We mentioned frogs before. Male frogs undergo amplexus, where they basically just kind of grab on and they don't let go once they find a gravid female who is likely to release eggs. And the idea is that basically that way your genital opening is right by hers, so that at the moment she releases her eggs, you can release your sperm and gain those reproductive opportunities. And then certainly mate guarding is another trait that is very common. We talked about a little bit. So here we've got a male, I forget what these guys are, some kind of goby, I think. But we've got a male, we've got a female, and the male basically just spends all of his time kind of following the female around. And you could call that love, or you could be a little bit more cynical and just say basically he's guarding her. So he's trying to mate with her, and also he's preventing other males from coming along and mating with her, and thereby preventing sperm competition. Questions on sperm competition? It's a lot of fun stuff. Okay, so that's discussion of male-male competition. What about female choice? So certainly a great deal of the really interesting stuff we see in terms of reproductive behavior has to do with this setting where females are choosing amongst males. And so we'll need to look at that and try to understand exactly what it is that they're gaining, what information are they gaining, why are they choosy, and what are they using to choose. Females are not passive bystanders in this whole process. Sometimes we'll talk about males competing for access to females, or competing to control females, or these sorts of terms that sometimes can be kind of loaded. And they're really just meant to be descriptive, as opposed to these, these ideas that in any way trying to identify that females are passive actors in this process. They are certainly not. So, for example, in the bowerbirds, the males are building all these bowers, they're courting, they're doing all these things. But when it comes down to it, it's the females that are driving this whole process. The mating decisions are almost entirely driven by female preferences for bowers and calls, and males have very little ability to solicit and gain reproductive success in any other way than to basically try to seduce females using these bowers. The population of females ultimately, in the case of the bowerbirds we saw, chooses just a handful of males to be the recipients of nearly all of the mating. So there's this tremendous disparity amongst the males in terms of their reproductive success, and that's due to females preferring certain males over others. In particular, as we said, the first 4 males are getting most of the matings within the population. So why do you have such disparities? What are the preferences, or what are the basis for having these really strong preferences? And we already put some ideas on the board in terms of why show such a strong preference. It is the case that not all females are really, really choosy. At least maybe not all females across all species are obviously choosy. So for example, when you do have populations in which males compete in a really aggressive fashion, and so you have these hierarchies where maybe there's just only one male around because that one male has basically repelled all the other males. In those settings, females will usually mate with that dominant male. And in part that might be because that dominant male is the only male that's around, right? I mean, he's done a good job of basically preventing other males from being present within the population. But usually that's probably a good thing for the female, though, because in those cases, in order to repel all the other males, the male basically has to kind of screen himself. And he has to demonstrate the only males that are going to be successful in that case are going to be those males that are very fit, that are very healthy, in good condition. So those are basically, by definition, going to be high-quality males. And that could be really advantageous to the females, really, because she doesn't have to go through some kind of a choosiness process. There are costs to being a choosy female. So you often would have to spend time searching around, evaluating other males. Sometimes you have to deal with males that are basically harassing you and seeking copulations. So that's certainly a time cost, if not an energetic cost. There are energetic costs to doing these kind of evaluation periods where you're going around and looking at other certain males and trying to decide which one to mate with. There was one study that was looking at marine iguanas and found that they spend about 2% of their daily energy budget, which doesn't seem like very much, but they actually found that that was enough to kind of tip the scales in terms of their energy balance, such that females actually lost weight while going through their period of being choosy, where they're sort of going from male to male in the population and evaluating them. So there are costs to being choosy. Therefore, there must be some benefits to being choosy. So in those species where we do see very choosy females, like we have in the bowerbirds, they must get some benefits. And there's been tremendous work trying to understand all the different kinds of benefits females can get. And they basically fall into two major categories, which we'll classify as either direct benefits or indirect benefits. In direct benefits, by being choosy and choosing the best male, females are directly benefiting from that. So by direct benefits, I mean they're getting like material resource benefits to them. So this could mean access to food or access to better territory, or other kinds of things where the female is directly having a benefit that she's experiencing for herself as a result of her choice. That's one kind of category of benefits. The other category of benefits would be indirect benefits. So these are non-material benefits, where it's less obvious what she's benefiting from. And most of the time when we're talking about indirect benefits, we're thinking about what are the benefits to the offspring. And oftentimes we're talking about, for example, genetic benefits. So getting good genes for your offspring by choosing a high-quality male would be an example of one of these kinds of scenarios. All right, so I am out of time. So we will have to pick up there and talk about these direct versus indirect benefits to female preferences. We'll do that on Thursday, and then we'll also start into the Chapter 10 materials. But aside from that, you guys can look forward. Hopefully we'll be planning for the beta lab at that time on Thursday.